Hey, picture this. What if I told you Japan, the land of samurai discipline and America's rock-solid ally in Asia, might be turning its back on US tech and cozying up to China instead? Yeah, I know. Sounds like something out of a geopolitical thriller. But stick with me because this is happening right now, and it's about to shake the world in ways you won't believe. Let's rewind a bit. Japan and the US have been tight since the end of World War II. Think about it. After those bombs dropped in '45, America didn't just rebuild Japan, they turned it into a tech powerhouse, pumping in money, ideas, and a whole lot of trust. By the 1980s, Japan was cranking out transistors and microchips like nobody's business. Sony Walkmans and Nintendo consoles were everywhere, and the US was cheering them on, buying up those exports like they were candy. It was a golden age. Japan became the world's second biggest economy, a shining example of what happens when two nations lock arms and build something massive together. But here's where it gets juicy. Fast forward to today, February 22nd, 2025. And that bond, it's starting to fray. Not because of some big dramatic fallout, but because the world's changing. And Japan's caught in the middle of a tech war that's heating up fast. You've got the US on one side, slapping tariffs left and right, trying to choke out China's rise. And then there's China, flexing its muscles, building its own tech empire. And Japan. Well, Japan's not just sitting pretty anymore. They're making moves, quiet ones, subtle ones, but moves that could flip the script on everything we thought we knew. So how did we get here? Let's peel back the layers, because this story's got history, suspense, and a twist you won't see coming first. Let's talk about the tech boom. Back in the 60s and 70s, Japan was the US's go-to partner for innovation. American companies like IBM and Texas Instruments set up shop there, sharing know-how, while Japanese firms like Toshiba and Hitachi soaked it all up. By the 80s, they were outpacing the US in semiconductors, those tiny chips that power everything from your phone to your car. Japan owned 51% of the global market in 1988. Think about that. Half the world's chips came from this island nation. And the US was cool with it, because Japan was an ally. A safe bet. Not some rival trying to topple them. Heck. During the Cold War, Japan was America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific, a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So tech flowed freely. Blueprints, patents, cash. All of it cemented this partnership that seemed unbreakable. But nothing lasts forever, right? Enter the 90s, and Japan's bubble bursts. Real estate crashes, stocks tank, and that economic miracle? It stalls out. The US starts looking elsewhere for cheap tech. Taiwan, South Korea, places where labor's cheaper and growth's faster. Japan's still in the game, don't get me wrong. Companies like Renesas and Tokyo Electron keep them relevant, but they're not the kingpin anymore. Meanwhile, China's waking up. Big time. By the 2000s, they're not just assembling iPhones. They're building their own giants. Huawei, SMIC, companies that scare the pants off Washington. And the US decides it's time to draw a line. Thus begins the tech war. Tariffs fly, export bans hit, and suddenly, Japan's stuck in the crossfire now. Let's zoom in on that tech war. It's February 2025, and things are wild. The US just dropped a bombshell. President Trump, back in the White House, signed an executive order on February 4th, slapping a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports. That's $500 to $25 billion worth of goods getting hit. And he's not stopping there. On February 18th, he announced plans for 25% tariffs on semiconductors and autos, set to kick in April 2. Why? He says it's to protect American jobs, bring manufacturing home. But the ripple effects, they're brutal. Japan's tech industry feels it hard. Those chips they make. A lot of the raw materials, like gallium and germanium, come from China. And guess what? China's not playing nice either. They've been tightening exports on those minerals since late 2024, citing national security. Sound familiar? It's the same game the US plays, and Japan's the one sweating. So here's Japan. Right. This tech titan with a $2 trillion economy, 125 million people, and a supply chain that's tangled up with both superpowers. They've got deep ties. With the US, military bases in Okinawa, trade deals galore, $50 billion in US tech exports flowing their way every year. But China? China's their neighbor, their biggest trading partner. $317 billion in trade in 2024 alone. And Beijing's dangling carrots, cheap resources, massive markets. Japan's got a choice to make, and it's not an easy one. Stick with the US and risk pissing off China, or lean into China and maybe, just maybe, betray a decades-old friendship. What would you do? Tough call, huh? Let's paint the scene. Imagine Tokyo, neon lights flickering, factories humming in Kawasaki, engineers hunched over quantum computing rigs. Japan's still got game. They're not some has-been. In 2024, they shipped $690 billion in goods worldwide. Tech's a huge chunk of that. Semiconductors, robotics, 5G gear. But the pressure's on. US tariffs are jacking up costs. China's export curbs are choking supply lines, and Japan's leaders, they're not dumb. They see the writing on the wall. America's pulling back, focusing inward, while China's pushing forward. Aggressive. Hungry. I mean, think about it. China's now the world's second biggest economy, $18 trillion GDP, and they're not slowing down. Japan's got to adapt or get left behind. Here's where it gets real. Back in July 2023, Japan slapped export controls on 23 types of chip-making equipment, aligning with the US to slow China's tech rise. Beijing wasn't happy. They hit back with those mineral restrictions. Fast forward to now, February 2025, and Japan's quietly rethinking that stance. Reports out of the Japan Times this month say they're easing up on some of those controls. Why? Because China's too big to ignore. Late last year, Japan's chip imports from China spiked 15%, hitting $12 billion, and trade talks with Beijing, they're picking up steam. Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa met her Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, in January. And whispers are swirling. Japan might be ready to pivot. Visualize this. Giant cargo ships docked in Yokohama, unloading crates of Chinese silicon wafers, while US diplomats in sleek suits pace nervously in Washington. Japan's not shouting this shift from the rooftops. Nah, that's not their style. They're subtle, calculated, but the numbers don't lie. US tech imports to Japan dropped 8% in 2024, $46 billion down from $50 billion. Meanwhile, China's shares creeping up, semiconductors, rare earths, even AI components. It's a slow bleed. And the US is starting to notice. Reuters reported on February 11th that American officials are concerned about Japan's drift. But here's the kicker. Japan's not drifting. They're steering, deliberately, toward a future where China might hold the keys. Let's step back. Why does this matter to you? Because tech's everything. Your phone, your car, the drone delivering your pizza. It all runs on chips, and who controls those chips controls the world. For decades, Japan and the US ran that show together. But if Japan pivots to China, it's not just a trade shift, it's a power shift. Imagine a world where China's calling the shots on 5G, quantum computing, AI, and Japan's feeding that machine, not America's. That's the stakes here. And it's unfolding right now, in real time, as we speak. So what's driving this? Economics? Sure. Japan's got to keep its factories humming, its people employed. But there's more. Geopolitics is a chess game, and Japan's playing it masterfully. They've got a pacifist constitution, sure. But don't let that fool you. They're strategic as hell. China's not just a market, It's a counterweight. The US has 54,000 troops in Japan, bases stretching from Hokkaido to Kyushu. But China's right there, 500 miles across the Sea of Japan, and Beijing's got leverage. Trade, tech, even soft power. Ever notice those Chinese tourists flooding Tokyo? $15 billion in spending last year. That's influence. Let's dive deeper. Japan's tech isn't just chips. It's the bleeding edge. Take quantum computing. Fujitsu and Riken rolled out a quantum processor in 2024 that's got the US salivating. But China's in the race too. Their Origin Wukong systems making waves. And Japan knows collaboration could leapfrog them ahead. Then there's 5G. Japan's NTT Docomo's a leader. But Huawei's cheaper, faster, and knocking on the door. US bands be damned. Japan's weighing its options, and the scales are tipping. Slowly, quietly, toward the east. Here's a visual for you. Think of a massive tech expo in Osaka. US booths packed with Intel reps pushing Xeon processors, while across the hall, Chinese firms like HiSilicon flash their Kirin chips. Japanese execs weaving between them. Poker faces on. But their eyes? They're darting toward China's side. It's not betrayal. Not yet. It's survival. Japan's got a shrinking population. 125 million down to 122 million in a decade. An aging workforce. They need partners who can keep the lights on. And China's got the juice. 1.4 billion people. A tech sector growing 7% a year. $1.2 trillion in output. But hold up. Let's not oversimplify. Japan's not dumping the US overnight. They've got too much history, too many ties. Think of the US-Japan Security Treaty, signed in '52, renewed in '60. It's ironclad. America's got Japan's back, and Japan's got bases hosting F-35s and aircraft carriers. That's not going away. But trade. Trade's fluid. And Japan's playing both sides, keeping the US close while testing China's waters. It's a tightrope walk, and they're damn good at it, so where's this heading? That's the million-dollar question. Right now, Japan's imports tell the tale. US tech slipping, China's rising, and the US-China tech war's only getting hotter. Trump's tariffs are a sledgehammer. China's retaliations, a scalpel, and Japan's dodging blows from both. But they're not just dodging. They're positioning, adapting, and maybe, just maybe, rewriting the rules. Stick with me, because this story's far from over. And what happens next? It's gonna blow your mind. So we've set the stage. Japan's been America's tech wingman for decades. But now, in February 2025, something's shifting. And it's not just whispers anymore. It's action. Real moves that are sending shockwaves through the global tech scene. Let's peel back the curtain and see what's really going down. Because this isn't some slow fade. It's a pivot. A bold one. And it's got the US scrambling. Picture this. Tokyo's skyline glowing at night. But behind those lights, boardrooms are buzzing. Japanese execs in sharp suits huddling with Chinese delegates. Deals being inked that could rewrite the rules of the game. This isn't speculation. It's happening, and the numbers back it up. Let's start with the bombshell. Japan's tightening the screws on its tech exports. Back in July 2023, they slapped controls on 23 types of chip-making gear, aligning with the US to box China out. But here's the twist. As of February 2025, they're easing up, not fully, but enough to raise eyebrows. The Japan Times dropped a report on February 15th saying, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industries reviewing those restrictions. Why? Because China's got leverage, and Japan's feeling the heat. Remember those rare minerals, like gallium and germanium, that Japan needs for chips? China's been squeezing exports since late 2024. The Financial Times reported on February 20 that China's new rules cut gallium shipments by 30%. That's a gut punch. Japan imports 90% of its gallium from China, and without it, Their $150 billion semiconductor industry grinds to a halt. Now visualize this. Factories in Osaka, usually churning out chips for everything from PlayStations to Toyotas, slowing down. Workers glancing at half-empty supply bins. Execs at Renesas and Tokyo Electron sweating as costs spike. China's not just playing defense, they're hitting back. And Japan's $2 trillion economy can't ignore it. Here's the kicker. US tariffs are making it worse. Trump's 10% levy on Chinese goods kicked in February 4. And on February 18th, he upped the ante. 25% tariffs on semiconductors and autos. Set for April. Reuters says that's $130 billion in Chinese tech exports getting hammered. But Japan's caught in the blast radius. Their supply chains are tangled with China. $317 billion in trade last year. And those US tariffs. They're jacking up prices on Japanese imports too. 8% of their US tech shipments now cost more to move. So, what's Japan doing? They're not just sitting there. They're pivoting. Trade data from Japan's customs office shows a 15% jump in chip imports from China in 2024, hitting $12 billion, and it's climbing. January 2025 alone saw a 10% uptick month over month. Meanwhile, US tech imports down 8% last year, $46 billion from $50 billion. That's not a blip. It's a trend, and it's accelerating. Think about this. Japan's not just buying more from China. They're talking more too. Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa was in Beijing, January 25th, meeting Wang Yi, China's top diplomat. The readout from China's foreign ministry was vague. Deepened strategic cooperation. But insiders say tech was on the table. Japan's eyeing China's massive market. 1.4 billion people and their own survival. Let's zoom in. Why is this shocking? Because Japan's been the US's tech anchor in Asia forever. They're the ones who helped build the chips that powered America's rise. But now, they're flirting with the enemy. At least, that's how Washington sees it. The U.S. State Department's concerned, per a February 11th Reuters piece. They're watching Japan's drift like hawks. But here's the thing. Japan's not drifting. They're choosing. And it's not emotional. It's cold, hard economics. China's too big to sideline. $690 billion in Japanese exports last year. 22% of that to China. Semiconductors alone. $30 billion, and China's dangling more. Cheap rare earths, discounted silicon wafers, access to their 5G rollout. Imagine this scene. Shanghai's Pudong district, gleaming towers. A trade expo where Chinese firms like SMIC and Huawei roll out red carpets for Japanese CEOs, offering deals the US can't match. Lower costs, faster delivery, and no tariffs. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, execs at Intel and Nvidia are fuming. Their $50 billion export pipeline to Japan's at risk. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo called it out on February 19th, saying Japan's realignment could undermine decades of partnership. But Japan's not blinking. They've got to keep their edge. Quantum computing, AI, robotics. And China's got the raw juice to make it happen. Here's some real talk. Japan's not abandoning the US completely. Not yet. They're still buying American. Intel's Xeon chips, Qualcomm's 5G gear. But the balance is shifting. Take quantum computing. Fujitsu's got a beast of a processor, unveiled in 2024 with Riken. 64 qubits, bleeding edge stuff. The US wants in. But China's Origin Wukong system? It's cheaper, scalable, and Beijing's pitching joint R&D. Japan's listening. Then there's 5G, NTT. Docomo's a global leader, but Huawei's undercutting them. 20% cheaper on base stations. Japan's telecoms are testing Huawei gear in rural areas. Quietly, off the radar. But it's happening. Let's throw some numbers at you. Japan's tech sector employs 3 million people, 10% of its workforce, 400 billion in output. If China locks them out of rare earths, that's 20% cost hikes overnight. Game over. But if they lean into China, they save billions, secure supply lines, and tap a market that's growing 7% a year. $1.2 trillion in tech spending, the US. Their tech growth's flatlining. 2% last year. Tariffs are choking it. Japan's doing the math, and it's not sentimental. $2 trillion economies don't run on loyalty. They run on profit. Visualize this. A cargo plane touching down in Narita, unloading crates stamped with Chinese characters, silicon wafers, gallium ingots, while a US freighter sits half empty on the tarmac. That's the reality. And it's not just hardware. Software's in play. Japan's AI startups, like Preferred Networks, are eyeing China's data pools, 1 billion internet users, training models that could outpace America's. The US bans Huawei. Sure, but Japan's not bound by that. They're pragmatic, and China's offering partnerships, not sanctions. So here's the midway punch. Stick around, because what Japan does next could change everything you know about global tech. Will they double down on China, cut the US loose, or play both sides until the wheels fall off? You don't want to miss this because the stakes, they're sky high and the clock's ticking. Let's dig deeper. What's China bringing to the table? Scale, speed, and a hunger to dominate. Their chip output's up 40% since 2023. Despite US bans, SMIC's pumping out 7-nanometer chips. Not cutting edge, but good enough, and cheap. Japan's buying, quietly, because their own foundries. $10 billion invested. Last year. Can't scale that fast. China's got 300 fabs cranking. Japan's got 50. It's not even a contest. And then there's the geopolitical angle. China's not just a supplier, they're a shield. The US is pulling inward. Trump's America First mantras, real. February 5th, he slashed $200 billion in foreign tech aid. Japan's feeling that pinch. Think about this. Japan's auto industry, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, they're chip hungry. 30 million vehicles a year. Each one needs 100 chips. US, tariffs are delaying shipments. China's stepping in. $5 billion in auto-grade chips exported to Japan in 2024, up 25% from 2023. That's real money, real jobs. And Japan's not blind. They see China's EVs. BYD's outselling Tesla globally, 5 million units last year. They want in on that action, not locked out by Uncle Sam's trade walls. Here's a wild stat. China holds 80% of the world's rare earths, $200 billion market. Japan's been stockpiling, sure, but that's a band-aid. China's export curbs since December 2024 have slashed Japan's reserves by 15%. They've got 6 months, tops, before they're begging. And China knows it. They're not just selling, they're negotiating. Trade talks in January hinted at a rare earths pact. Japan sends tech know-how. China sends minerals. Win-win, right? Except for the US, who's left out in the cold. Let's paint this picture. Hokkaido's ports, usually quiet, now buzzing with Chinese ships, unloading tech components while US diplomats in Tokyo draft urgent cables. Japan's not shouting about this pivot. They're too slick for that. But the signs are everywhere. Exports to China up 5% in January. $58 billion. US share down 3%. $42 billion. It's a slow bleed, but it's deliberate. And Washington's waking up too late. So, what's the insight here? Japan's not just cutting US imports, they're rethinking the whole damn system. Decades of trust with America. It's on the table. China's not a sidekick anymore. They're a player, and Japan's betting big, not out of spite, but survival. Their economy's too fragile, too exposed to stick with a US that's turning inward. This is chess, not checkers. And Japan's 3 moves ahead. All right, we've seen Japan's history with the US. We've uncovered their quiet shift toward China. But now it's time for the real bombshell. Because this isn't just about Japan cutting a few US tech imports. No, this could be the start of something way bigger. A seismic jolt that rewrites the global tech map. Picture this. Japan doesn't just pivot to China for survival. They might actually become China's tech lifeline. The key that unlocks Beijing's dream of dominating the 21st century. And if that happens, the US? They're not just losing a partner. They're losing their grip. Let's dive in, because this twist changes everything first. Let's ground this in what's happening right now. February 22nd, 2025. The US-China tech war's raging. Trump's tariffs are slamming $525 billion in Chinese goods, 10% across the board since February 4, and 25% on chips and autos coming April 2. China's hitting back. 15% tariffs on US coal and LNG, 10% on crude oil and big cars. Announced February 3rd. It's chaos. But Japan? They're not panicking. They're plotting. Trade numbers don't lie. China's their top export market, $690 billion in potential. And Japan's already leaning in. Chip imports from China up 15% in 2024, $12 billion. US imports down to $46 billion. That's real momentum. And it's picking up speed now. Imagine this. Japan's not just buying from China. They're syncing up. Think about their tech edge, quantum computing. Fujitsu and Riken's 64-qubit processor from 2024. It's world-class. China's got Origin Wukong, 256 qubits. Not as polished but scalable. What if Japan shares know-how? China's got the muscle. 300 chip fabs. $1.2 trillion tech output. Growing 7% a year. Japan's got precision. 50 fabs. But the best in extreme ultraviolet lithography. Pair that up, and you've got a powerhouse. Suddenly, China's not stuck at 7-nanometer chips. They're jumping to 3, with Japan's help. That's a nightmare for the US, who's banking on keeping China behind. Visualize this. Tech labs in Shenzhen. Japanese engineers in crisp white coats tweaking machines next to Chinese teams. Churning out chips that undercut Intel and TSMC. It's not fantasy. Trade talks are heating up. January's Kamikawa Wang Yi meeting wasn't just tea and smiles. Insiders say Japan's pitching tech swaps. Rare earths for expertise. China's gallium curbs since December 2024 slashed Japan's reserves 15%. 6 months left. Beijing's offering a lifeline. $200 billion in rare earths. 80% of the world's supply. Japan can't say no. And if they lock in, they're not just a customer, they're a partner. Let's talk stakes. US tech exports to Japan. $50 billion a year. Semiconductors alone $20 billion. If Japan cuts that 20%, that's $10 billion gone. Poof. Intel's already shaky. Stocks down 30% since January. Nvidia's sweating too. Japan's their third biggest market. Now flip it. China's chip output jumps 40% since 2023. SMIC's cranking 7-nanometer chips despite bans. Add Japan's finesse. And they're flooding markets. Cheap, fast, reliable. US firms can't compete. Not with tariffs jacking costs 25%. Japan's autos. Toyota, Honda, 30 million cars a year. 100 chips each. They're already buying $5 billion in Chinese auto-grade chips, up 25% from 2023. That's just the start. Here's the twist. Japan's not picking sides, not fully. They're rewriting the game. Think about it. The US has 54,000 troops in Japan. Bases from Hokkaido to Kyushu. That's not changing. But trade's where the power's shifting. Japan's playing both superpowers. Keeping America close for security. China close for cash. It's genius. $310 billion in trade with China. $211 billion with the US. They're balancing, but the tilt's clear. China's shares growing, 22% of Japan's exports. US is 18% and dropping. This isn't betrayal. It's strategy. A $2 trillion economy staying alive in a world where loyalty's a luxury. Let's paint this picture. Yokohama's ports, Chinese freighters unloading silicon wafers, US ships half empty, drifting off. While in Tokyo, Prime Minister Ishiba's on the phone with Xi Jinping, not Biden. It's February 2025, and Japan's quantum labs are buzzing. Not with American specs, but Chinese ones, 5G networks. NTT Docomo's testing Huawei gear, 20% cheaper, rural towers popping up. US bans don't bind Japan, they're free agents, and China's capitalizing, offering $100 billion in joint ventures, AI, robotics, green tech. Japan's listening. Because their population's shrinking. 122 million now, down 3 million in a decade. They need growth. Fast. Now, the data dive. Japan's tech sector, $400 billion, 3 million jobs. Semiconductors are 40% of that. $160 billion US tariffs could cost them 10% in export losses. $16 billion. China's offering a buffer. $30 billion in chip exports to Japan, growing 5% monthly. Then there's AI. Preferred networks. Japan's star startup. They're eyeing China's 1 billion internet users, training models that could dwarf America's US growth's flat. 2% in tech last year. China's 7%, $1.2 trillion in output. Japan's picking the winner, not the nostalgia. Imagine this. US Commerce Secretary Raimondo, February 19th. She's on CNN voice tight, saying Japan's realignment could cost American jobs. She's right. $50 billion in exports at risk. 200,000 workers tied to that. Auto plants in Michigan, chip fabs in Oregon. They're sweating because Japan's not just cutting imports. They're redirecting China's EVs, BYD's 5 million units last year, outselling Tesla. They're courting Japan, joint factories in Osaka, $10 billion deals. Toyota's tempted. Why not? US tariffs make American parts pricier. China's don't. Here's the gut punch. What if Japan's pivot isn't the endgame, but the spark? China's tech rise accelerates. Japan's their launchpad. And the US. They're scrambling. Allies, like South Korea, Taiwan, they're watching. If Japan pulls this off, profit over loyalty. Who's next? Seoul's chip giants, Samsung, SK Hynix. They're already cozy with China. 30% of their exports. This could domino. A new tech bloc. China, Japan, maybe more. $3 trillion in combined output, outpacing America's $2.5 trillion. That's not a trade shift. That's a new world order. Let's zoom out. Visualize a map. Red lines linking Tokyo to Beijing. Fading blue ones to Washington. Japan's not just surviving. They're thriving. $690 billion in trade potential with China. 5G, AI, quantum, all syncing up. The US can't stop it. Not with tariffs. Not with bans. Japan's too slick, too strategic. They've got the US over a barrel. Security ties. And China in their pocket. Trade goldmine. It's a masterstroke, and it's unfolding now. So here's the big finish. Japan's pivot could be the domino that topples America's tech empire. Or the spark that ignites a new Cold War, not with guns, but chips, data, power. They're not dumping the US. Not yet. But they're betting on China's rise. And if they're right, the world flips. US dominance. 50 years strong. Cracks. China's century kicks in. Japan's the kingmaker. Wild. Right? What do you think? Will Japan choose profit over loyalty? Can the US pull them back? Hit the comments, because this story's not done. It's just starting.